Story of Cuba and Fidel Castro, headliner throughout 1959.
Spain originally had control of Cuba, but after the Cuban War of Independence in 1895, they essentially came under the influence of the United States. The United States remained in control until 1902, when the Platt Amendment was created, making Cuba an official protectorate of the United States. This plan was not ideal for Cuba. There were various protests and radical movements that went against the government that Cuba had in place, the most famous ones being led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. After the Cuban Revolution took place, Fidel Castro was now in power of Cuba, and he was not without enemies. The United States took notice of Castro and his rebellious actions against the United States. He decided to align with the Soviet Union in hopes that they would be able to help Cuba with their economic situation and various other problems. The entire Cuban Revolution had a large effect on all of the countries that were involved. Here to talk about Cuba itself during the Cuban Revolution, we have Katie Urban.
Fulgencio Batista ruled in some form from 1933 to 1959. Overall, his rule was corrupt, and he supported the rich, organized crime, and the interests of the United States. His repressive policies took away civil liberties and widened the gap between the rich and the poor. His oppressive rule on the lower class created dissatisfaction within the Cuban people. One such person was Fidel Castro. In 1945, he was studying law at the University of Havana and participated in student-led protests against imperialism and the United States intervention in Cuba. He gravitated towards Marxism and grew the belief that Cuba's problems stemmed from capitalism and the ruling elites. In 1950, he finished his law degree and began bringing cases against Batista's regime. But none of these came to fruition and little change was made to the system. 2 years after this failure, Castro believed that change might be able to come from another way, and so he formed the Movement, a rebellion against Batista. This rebellion didn't go so well, and so Castro left Cuba for Mexico, where he met Che Guevara. At the age of 25, Che witnessed a United States-engineered coup in Guatemala that had a profound effect on his political views and marked the point in which he decided to become a revolutionary. Being an open sympathizer of the overthrown government, Che fled to Mexico. Once Castro and Che met, they never looked back and instead focused on rebelling against Batista's regime in Cuba. In this period of his life, Ernesto Guevara picked up the nickname Che, which meant something along the lines of hey, and was given to him by his Cuban comrades because of his Argentine mannerism of beginning or ending the sentences with hey. In the early 1960s, Cuba and the Soviet Union had a very close relationship, as the USSR provided economic aid to Cuba and made various deals to help one another. However, Castro saw himself as a revolutionary and thought it his duty to support other revolutionaries in Latin America and later in Africa. The Soviet Union did not like this, as it decreased their support from third world countries, but the USSR thought that it was worth keeping Cuba as long as they were a strong ally and shared their opinions on the United States. Religion was outlawed as a means of ensuring power in Cuba by Castro, but Cuba progressed as a country. They had the highest literacy rate in Latin America and the lowest infant mortality rate, but the economy never rebounded and it was basically socialism or death. Civil liberties were taken away and many upper class fled the country. In the late 1960s, the economy was crashing and there was a reliance on the USSR for aid, and there was a party line from Moscow until Mongolia. This was also around the time when Castro implemented the Year of the 10 Million. The Year of the 10 Million was an economic plan where Cuba was going to plant, harvest, and sell 10 million tons of sugar, but they only reached 7 tons. This plan didn't work, obviously. The main point to take away from all of this was that the Cuban Revolution did not have a positive effect on Cuba. Batista's oppressive rule was gone, only to be replaced by Castro's rule. The economy were suffering, and so were the Cuban people.
Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union in an attempt to show the United States that they were both against capitalism. We now have Lily Bauman, our expert of the Soviet Union, to talk about the USSR during the Cuban Revolution.
The Soviet Union began aiding Cuba in February of 1960 with a trade agreement between Cuban sugar and Soviet oil. In July, the USSR furthered their relationship with Cuba by promising to defend Cuba with rockets should the US attack. Additionally, in September, the Soviet Union sent military aid to Cuba. Later, in 1972, the Soviet-Cuban trade agreements were revised in response to the failing Cuban economy. This had a large impact on the Soviet Union's economy, as Cuba's sugar was sold at very high prices, while the Soviet Union's oil was sold at very low prices. As a result, the USSR's economy suffered. Some benefits of the Soviet Union gained from the Cuban Revolution and their alliance with Cuba was a communist nation in the Western Hemisphere and enhanced prestige in the Third World.
As Lily told us, Cuba and the Soviet Union joined forces in order to show the United States that communism would prevail. This caused the United States to take precautions in order to ensure that this would not happen. We have Himal Subramanya here, our resident expert on the United States, in order to speak about the effect of the Cuban Revolution on the United States.
Batista had close ties to the U.S. government and U.S. organized crime, especially in the Cuban capital Havana, which had long been a haven for gamblers, drug dealers, and prostitutes. However, the U.S. only recognized the Cuban government in 1959. President Eisenhower offered a friendly hand to Cuba 6 days after Batista left Cuba on January 7, 1959. Batista had left Cuba on January 1st of that year because Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces successfully overthrew the government. Although this was meant to maintain a good relationship between the two countries, relations worsened within a year because Castro refused to bow down to the U.S. The U.S. decided to rebuild Cuba's economy in order to promote American investment and therefore keep Cuba in its sphere. Although Cuba greatly benefited from American control, such as eradication of most diseases and famine, and better education population to raise their literacy rates and general well-being, Cuba was stuck in the U.S.'s control economically. The U.S. controlled its sugar industry, which was the sole crop that Cuba's economy depended on. This led to tensions between Castro and the U.S. since Castro wanted to get away from the control of global superpowers. In addition to economic control, the U.S. also had political control of Cuba. The U.S. was keen to direct Cuba towards a stable self-government. The U.S. government forced Cuba to accept the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. the right to military intervention and naval bases in Cuba legally. The Platt Amendment was officially added in March 1901. It still exists today since the U.S. runs a base at Guantanamo Bay. As a result of Cuba being under the control of the U.S. superpower, notable leaders Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led protests and radical movements in order to try to overthrow the U.S.'s control in Cuba. Unlike with the USSR, Cuba did not have similar intentions as the U.S. and therefore only cooperated with the U.S. for financial aid after the sugar economy started crashing in the late 1960s.
After the Cuban Revolution, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which began with the transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy. Unlike Eisenhower, Kennedy decided to extend the boundaries of containment to Latin America, because Castro continued to endorse any revolutions there. There was then the Bay of Pigs, the Second Berlin Crisis, Operation Mongoose, and Operation Añadir. Here to talk to us about Cuba again, here is Katie Urban.
Although being the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union basically kept Cuba out of the loop. Prior to the crisis, the United States had two major attempts at throwing Castro. The first was the Bay of Pigs, where the United States trained Cuban refugees and sent them back to Cuba in order to spark an uprising against Castro. This didn't work out very well and was a basic failure. The other attempt was Operation Mongoose, which consisted of a bunch of assassination attempts thought up by the United States. Much like the Bay of Pigs, Operation Mongoose did not come to any solution and eventually was discontinued due to lack of results. Because of these attempts on Castro's life, he agreed to let the USSR put nuclear weapons in Cuba in order to deter the United States' involvement in the country itself. This, however, did not go according to plan. During the actual missile crisis itself, Castro was left out of discussions and was hardly consulted on anything the Soviet Union did. This led Castro to become enraged by the Soviet Union, and he essentially split ties with the USSR after the crisis. Following the withdrawal of weapons, Castro made 5 demands from the United States. These demands were: 1. Cessation of the United States economic embargo on Cuba and United States pressure on other countries to cut commercial links to Cuba. 2. End U.S. subversive activities against Cuba. 3. Cease piratical attacks from bases in the United States and Puerto Rico. 4. End violations of Cuban airspace. And 5. The United States withdrawal from Guantanamo Naval Base. In response to these demands made by Cuba, the United States merely laughed them off, and nothing came of Castro's wishes.
As Katie said, relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba by the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis were rather bad, on both sides. We, once again, have Lily here to speak about the effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis on the Soviet Union.
The USSR responded to the failure of the US's Bay of Pigs by taking advantage of Kennedy's vulnerability and built a barrier between East and West Berlin, splitting the two. The USSR also felt the need to protect and defend Cuba from US attacks. Khrushchev begins Operation Anadyr in order to achieve this. He secretly begins sending nuclear warheads to Cuba. However, the US created a blockade to stop the Soviet ships from reaching the island. In response to this blockade, the Soviet ships turned around and did not attempt to break through the blockade. Khrushchev then sent messages to Kennedy in attempts to reach an agreement over Cuba. The resulting agreement consisted of the USSR's nuclear warheads and missiles being removed from Cuba, and the US promising to stop attacking Cuba. This result was not in favor of Khrushchev or the USSR, as it was seen as a win for the US. Castro was enraged with Khrushchev because he did not consult him when he was making this final decision and agreement with the US.
The tensions that came from the Cuban Missile Crisis can be attributed to the United States, as they were seen as the victors after the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. Here's Himal to speak about how the United States essentially caused the new tensions between the Soviet Union and Cuba.
Although Eisenhower attempted to create a good relationship with Castro-led Cuba in an effort to secure control in the Western Hemisphere, the policies created after Castro became the Cuban leader escalated tensions between the superpowers instead of creating a diplomatic relationship. After Kennedy took office in January 1961, he dealt with the effects of the Cuban Revolution leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis by enacting several policies to keep the USSR in check. His first major action as a president, which was a failure, was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. A CIA brigade group wished to overthrow the increasingly communist Cuban government led by Fidel Castro on April 17, 1961. They had launched from Guatemala, where CIA operatives had been training under Eisenhower's orders, using $13 million that Eisenhower had given them to overthrow Castro. However, since aerial forces were withdrawn last minute and the Cuban forces were near the coast and ready for the U.S.'s surprise attack, the invading force was defeated after 3 days by Castro's revolutionary armed forces. This caused the USSR and Cuba to strengthen their relationship due to common interests. Meanwhile, due to the USSR's need to continue getting rid of American influence, the USSR asked for the West to withdraw its forces in West Berlin. And when that didn't happen, the Soviets built a wall around Western Berlin and isolated the West from the East. This escalated tensions between the USSR and the US, since Western powers wanted to have a militarized and occupied presence in West Berlin, while the USSR wanted East Berlin to have more control over West Berlin and keep Western powers away from the communist sphere. After a meeting at Geneva, the USSR told the US that it had shot down a U-2 spy plane in 1960, so any hope of reconciliation between the superpowers was gone. Escalating tensions led Khrushchev to decide to build the Berlin Wall. This crisis ended when the US and USSR agreed to remove tanks at the border. Khrushchev agreed with Cuba and placed nukes near the US in order to counter the nuclear attack, while the US kept nukes in Turkey to counter the USSR. Ultimately, both countries did not want to go to nuclear war and agreed to remove their nukes and thus avoided escalation into a full-scale nuclear war.
In terms of the Cold War, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union, meaning that they essentially showed the world that they were a communist nation. Even more, that they were against the United States and its policies. This caused the United States to become more motivated in their attempts to get rid of Castro, and to further increase the tensions between the US and the USSR. However, at the end, the tensions decreased, as both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that nuclear warfare was not the proper way to settle things, and that simple negotiation was better.